Hello and welcome to the Chiltern Learning Trust EdTech podcast. I'm Christian Turton, EdTech lead at Chiltern Learning Trust. At Chiltern Learning Trust, we're a multi-academy trust currently comprising of 18 schools across Luton and Bedfordshire. Our schools and staff are unified through our trust values of honesty, care, collaboration, inspiration, ambition and belonging. We're a family trust and work towards the collective good of all of our students. The Trust has long had an EdTech strategy, winning awards and being featured in national and international case studies. I joined as EdTech lead in September 2024 to lead the Trust into its next phase of development with EdTech and rollout of AI to support workload and improve outcomes for all of our students. The aim of this podcast is to share our journey with EdTech and AI at Chiltern Learning Trust, both with each other and more widely with our audience. We will interview external expert guests on topics such as AI, digital pedagogy and online safety, as well as our community of technology for learning leaders in our schools, sharing some of the excellent practice happening already in our schools and gaining insights from our external experts that we can put into practice. Today, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome two guests to the podcast. Firstly, Dr Fiona Aubrey-Smith, author and researcher, named in 2024 as one of the top 5 visionary women in education. Fiona is co-author of the highly influential book From EdTech to PedTech, Changing the Way We Think About Digital Technology, and author of the impact study, Changing Learning, Changing Lives, looking at the impact of the Leo Academy Trust's journey with EdTech and its impact on their learners. Both of these have been hugely influential on the work that we do in EdTech at Chiltern Learning Trust. Fiona, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's great to be with you.
We also have Sarah White, Technology for Learning Lead at Lark Rise Academy, a primary school within the Trust. Sarah has done a lot of work in supporting other schools within the Trust and recently led the school to become the first primary to have a one-to-one device chromebook programme. Welcome, Sarah.
Good morning.
Okay, so today we're going to be particularly focusing on how digital technologies can best support pedagogical approaches, something that I'm very passionate about getting right and love talking about. We'll also be considering how giving every learner a device known as a one-to-one programme can improve learning and how to ensure that that can be successfully implemented, thinking about what teachers perhaps need to know about that. So I'm going to start with a question for you, Sarah, if that's okay. Can you tell us a bit of a context, a little bit about Lark Rise Academy and what made you decide to go one-to-one this September?
Yes, so we're at lovely mixed age primary school and we had been using Chromebooks for a few years before we made the decision to go one-to-one. So we had a trolley of Chromebooks in each of our key stages. But as we started to use them more, we found it was really hard to be able to offer the consistency that we wanted to because we had to timetable their use. And then at the same time, we were really fortunate to be invited to a Leo Academy school visit by Emma Darcy at Denby High. And myself and Ramina Lang, the head teacher at Lark Rise, we were just absolutely blown away by what we saw at the Leo Academy and how teachers could really use technology to just make learning accessible for everybody. And just something that really stood out from the visit for us was just how engaged and excited children were to be using the Chromebooks and how seamlessly teachers could make sure that in every lesson all children could showcase their knowledge and learning with the support of technology. So we definitely left from that visit just really feeling excited to explore a one-to-one device scheme more. And what's been really wonderful that following our visit with the Leo Academy, they've been really helpful in helping us to roll out our one-to-one scheme. So Cheryl and Graham have been so lovely with giving us really practical tips and helping us to roll out our scheme effectively.
it sounds like that accessible use and that kind of equity that they bring has been kind of really, really important to you, and also that engagement as well. So that's really interesting. So I wonder, Fiona, if I could ask you a question now. Your work's been really influential on everyone kind of using technology for learning, and you've coined the term PedTech. And now I'm aware you've written a whole book on the topic, but I wonder if you'd be able to summarise for us the idea behind PedTech and how that might shift our focus when we're using digital technologies in the classroom.
Great question. And I think there's probably two things behind that. So the term PedTech isn't pedagogical technologies. It's not about the tools themselves. It's a mindset. And that's really, really important, because historically in the kind of education technology digital space, there's been this kind of EdTech mindset that's very much pivoted around tools themselves. Like, how can we use these tools to support what we do in the classroom around our schools? And that's brilliant as a starting point, but all the research that explores the impact and the difference, the benefit, the enhancements, all shows us time and time again that that's entirely dependent upon having a really clear view on what we're actually trying to achieve in that moment of provision. And actually, when we think about that in educational context, that's our pedagogy. So when I use the word pedagogy, what I mean is the structural support of learners and learning. So not the processes of learning, not the science of learning, not the experience of learning, but the structural support in play. And that's all about what the environment is, what the thinking is, what the role of the school is in that learner's life, what the role of others, including but not limited to teacher, is. There's lots and lots of things in the mix there. So the PedTech mindset says, let's get clear on that, the pedagogy first. What are we actually trying to achieve in our existence as a classroom, as a school, or as a trust? And then when we have that clarity, let's bring in digital tools to help us support exactly those intentions. And that's really vital, because it sounds like a very subtle distinction, and it is quite a subtle distinction, but it makes a massive, massive difference on impact. Absolutely massive.
You're saying the research shows we really need to have a clear view on what we're trying to achieve from a pedagogical point of view.
It demands us that we think quite differently about the leadership of the space of education technology as well, and of digital, because traditionally those leading the charge, if you like, about using digital tools have been from a sort of IT computing type background or mindset. And actually that's really important and brings an incredibly valuable set of skills. But we want to kind of pair that up with those leading teaching and learning, leading education, leading strategic thinking about schools and organisations of schools, so that the leadership is a pedagogy-driven leadership as well. So I think that element's really important too.
I think that's really interesting what you said there in terms of kind of where you're coming from it, whether it's from an IT background, and I've always found it very interesting during lockdown, where we all had to switch to using technology, and in the school that I was in then, I found it very interesting that some of those that were making the most successful use of kind of technology were those whose pedagogy was really strong as a teacher, but they themselves might have said they weren't very confident with technology because they were coming from that kind of perspective.
It can be a huge strength, actually, that, because what it does is it creates this really objective, critical lens to look at digital through. It demands that we think then about, okay, what difference is this actually going to make for the teacher or for the learners? And that's the starting point of the conversation. So it can actually be a really powerful thing. And I think that came out in what Sarah was saying earlier on about the drivers being about consistency of provision for children and teachers, about accessibility for everybody, and about the seamless teaching and learning provision in play. So I think you can clearly hear those tones of pedagogy in the very thinking and the very vocabulary being used. And
Sarah, maybe if I could bring you in, I know you're very aware of this kind of the PedTech approach, and how did that influence your rollout of the one-to-one programme and what you've done with technology there?
So I think when I first started becoming Tech for Learning lead, I think you're very aware that technology is wonderful and you can have so many tools and so many programs, and it's really tempting to be kind of lured into using them without really thinking about the why. So we've been really mindful to think first about what our children actually need to be successful learners, and what what does that successful learning actually look like? And then when we've got this really clear in our minds, then we can start thinking about what barriers are there that can stop children from becoming successful learners, and then how can we use perhaps technology and appropriate tools to help them with the barriers. So for example, I was finding in my class lots of children have incredible ideas, particularly with topics like World War II, or we were reading our various texts in English, but when it came to the writing side, they had kind of real barriers with this. So we started to experiment with tools like voice typing or collaborative collaborative whiteboards to really help them with the creative process and to free up their cognitive load. So then that enables them now to share their knowledge in the same way as all the other children in the class, but just using those tools to really answer the why. What do the children need to help them to be successful in this learning? So our kind of one-to-one device scheme has been born from this thinking about our learners and their needs first, and then building our kind of tools around this. So we've got like a set of core programs that we kind of provide for teachers, but they all answer the question, why are we using these? We're using them because they're to support our children and specific needs of children in the classroom.
Fantastic. There's lots of things in there, and I think, thinking about that why, it really communicates then, helps staff and students and pupils to understand the reason for the one-to-one program, and then looking at those barriers and thinking about what you're going to use there. And of course, there's so many accessible tools and technology that are often underexplored and underused, and that's fantastic that your pupils are becoming. Would you say they're quite independent in using those as well?
I think independent, and it also means that, and this was something that really came from our visit from the Leo that we really loved, that when you spoke to the children, the tools that they were using, they were completely kind of bespoke and personal to them. They didn't have to put their hand up and say to a teacher, I need help with this. They could be accessing the tools independently and kind of privately, and I think that's really important for lots of children, that you don't maybe want to broadcast to the rest of the class if you're finding things difficult, but it allows them to use tools to support their specific needs, which is just lovely to see in action in a classroom.
And that's a perfect lead into the next question that I had for Fiona, Sarah, as well. So thank you for that. In Changing Learning, Changing Lives, Fiona, you looked at the impact on learners' special educational needs in the one-to-one programme. And I know we have increasing needs within our mainstream schools. And there's a huge potential there that we've already sort of started to discuss. So when running CPD in schools, I often have a slide which has a quote from Changing Learning, Changing Lives as well. And it's from the Key Stage 2 pupil, which says, I used to get anxious, now because I can access help whenever I need it and write using voice record, I know I can finish my work and do it well. What impact did you find on these learners, Fiona, and what can we be doing in schools to ensure you make full use of this potential?
Great question, and it's so good that we're really zooming in on these young people in particular, because often the children who face the greatest barriers are those who technology can make a massive difference for. And I think, as Sarah pointed out, giving that dignity in the moment of learning, whether that's through the use of tools or whether that's simply being able to access support and help, waggles or examples, word banks, vocabulary, manipulatives, whatever it might be that will help them with that. So in terms of what impact we found, I think two things. First is, if you equip young people with the tools that can help them hurdle over these barriers, not just climb them, but hurdle over them. And I'll come back to what sort of tools in just a sec. If you equip children with these tools, and if you equip them with an environment where they feel able to choose and use relevant tools at the point of need, then actually the impact is massive for children from all different contexts and characteristics. but those two things need to coexist together. So to give you a couple of examples, in terms of tools, I think simple things like dictate features, like talk to text, simple things like having subtitles on a screen, whether that's in English or auto-translated into a second language, during teacher input, simple things like recording teacher verbal feedback as the teacher moves around the room, so that a child can, rewind and listen to that feedback again once the teacher's moved on. Can help with working memory, things like that. Things like having a one-stop shop for resources and support specific to a task, like a writing toolkit or a screencast or recording of the teacher input or the modelling that a child can rewind. Simple things like those things make a huge difference, because what they're doing is actually bringing agency to the learner to get on and do what they want to do. And most learners, if they can do it themselves, want to do it themselves. We're the same as adults, aren't we?
Yeah.
And secondly, that's actually creating capacity for the learner, because they're not sitting waiting, losing valuable learning time, waiting for the teacher to come to them. And it's creating capacity for the teacher, because they're not repeating the same modelling or explanation over and over and over again to different children who are physically sat different parts of the classroom. They've got scale through recording, so children can go back and watch that, listen to that over and over and over again. They can watch a little bit, pause, move on, watch another little bit, pause, move on. And I don't think we utilise those opportunities enough. So there's, those are the great starting points I'd lean into. And in terms of just making the impact tangible for, in terms of attainment, I mean, you referred to the Changing Learning, Changing Lives report. That showed year-on-year increases in attainment across core subjects, across the whole trust. And we're now so we've got data for the last 4 years, and that's still growing. The trust outcomes are still outperforming national averages, but the interesting thing is the gap is still growing, and that's the effect of the cumulative gains you're getting year on year for each of these cohorts of children. And it's bucking the national trends. It's a really interesting one. And in terms of our young people with special educational needs, you referred to earlier, Sarah and Christian, the increase we're seeing come into all of our classrooms of different kinds of additional needs, and therefore requiring different kinds of additional interventions. If we have a look at what's happening in Leo, where all children have on-demand access to tools and a culture of on-demand access, we're seeing the level of interventions required, so as reflected by the SEM register, year on year go down. And that's not that the level of need is going down, it's the requirement for intervention is going down. So there's massive implications there on classroom teachers, and financial and time implications as well. So really interesting things to be thinking about.
You talked about those simple tools such as dictate, the teacher recording verbal feedback, so pupils can listen to it again, and also recording explanations so that pupils can have a look at that, and all things that are quite built into pretty much most devices, aren't they? They're quite simple things to use, but it can be very tempting, and especially if we're walking around shows and things like that, to look at some of the lots of expensive tools that have lots of bells and whistles, but some of those really fundamental things can have the greatest impact when used well and focusing on the kind of the pedagogy of it. So, Sarah, can I ask you what you've seen in terms? Because Fiona was talking about some of the impact there that she saw in Leo academies, and it's amazing that tracking of data is continuing, and it's continuing to go up as well and be above the national average. What kind of impact have you seen? You're quite early on in your one-to-one programme, Sarah. So what does that look like at the moment for you?
Yeah, I guess in terms of impact at the moment, we've got a lot of kind of anecdotal evidence. Yes. And I'm really lucky that I'm in the classroom every day. So it's a really wonderful position to be Tech for Learning lead and in the classroom. And for me personally, I think it's really changed the feeling of the class across all of the lessons, because all children can take part, because they're able to use tools to support them. So, for example, in writing, the children have just produced a descriptive write of Narnia, and you can feel like the excitement and the engagement in the class, because all of the children can take part. And I think for me as a teacher, when you get to to read their work, it just really reinforces why we've decided to do this, because all of the children's work is just so wonderful, and to see children's reaction to kind of their work when it's been looked at or they've shared it in class is just really wonderful to see. So I really feel the kind of the benefits in writing, but also in our maths. And again, if we go back to the why we're using the technology, I was finding that kind of reasoning and answering questions in class was perhaps a little bit daunting for children. So again, we were thinking about how could we use technology to help this. So using things like a collaborative whiteboard to answer a reasoning question has had a really good impact on children's ability to kind of think through a problem, talk it through with their talking partner, and then share among the class and kind of build on each other's ideas, so that when they come to that end point of actually sharing their answer verbally, it's just had a really good impact on their kind of oracy skills. And I think for children who perhaps aren't so confident, it's really helping them to build in confidence. So something that I've seen now is kind of a lot more hands up, like throughout the lesson, of children being willing to have a go with tricky questions. And I think it's because they've had that experience of kind of using technology to share their answers through with the rest of the class. And just another final thing I've really enjoyed with the technology, seeing how children are now wanting to use the Chromebooks efficiently. So going back to Fiona's, the lovely idea of having like that one-stop shop of resources, we've started to look at like shortcuts. So how can we teach the children to like effectively manage their screens? And they just love like I think a shortcut for a primary school child is just like the most wonderful thing. But when we walk around the room and we're seeing their screen, they're really thinking about how can I arrange my screen so that I can work efficiently? And I think just to see children learning in that way is just wonderful to see.
Well, I just got really excited listening to something Sarah was saying just then, because there's two, and this is what I love about the work you're doing, Sarah. It's so focused about seeing this through the lens of pedagogy first, and that's that's what will make it so impactful. So you were talking then about simple things like children making their devices feel like their own, and what they're leaning into there is taking ownership of their learning, ownership of the tools that they're using to support their learning. They're thinking about themselves and their identity as a learner. They're in that metacognitive space of what do I need and when, therefore what will I put in this corner of my screen, or what image will I have over there, or what do I want as a shortcut. They're starting to think really critically about the sort of metacognitive processes behind their learning, and that's massively empowering for young people. Well, for all of us, isn't it? How we organise our own workspaces. And that thing about participation that you touched upon, you see a lot at the moment across the school space about the use of things like adaptive teaching, and it's really reading young people and their responses in order to then adapt what the teacher does next. But of course, one of the really, really hard things to do in traditional ways of working is to read the data for every question, for every child at every moment in a class. I mean, it's impossible, isn't it? You've got 30-something children, you ask a question, how can any teacher remember all 30 responses and then move on to the next question and then remember another 30 responses? It's just impossible. But a teacher, in order to be the most effective teacher, needs to have a real sense of that data. So the reality for a lot of teachers is you kind of read the themes, read the majority of the room. You kind of get the bell curve of what's going on in the class and maybe a couple of outliers. The challenge with that is it creates this kind of halo effect thing where we make big assumptions based on themes in a class. And of course, what that's not then doing is meeting what Sarah beautifully referred to earlier as the needs of every single learner in the class. It's meeting the majority, not every single learner in the class. And that's where some simple digital tools, and there's loads of adaptive teaching type tools, that's where they can really empower the teacher, because you've got every single child able to respond to every single question, and the teacher's got it all as maybe a colour-coded dashboard in front of them. So they're not only reading the responses for individual questions, they're also looking at trends, seeing them over time, and capturing that data as a kind of three-dimensional understanding of what's happening per child and per bit of taught content. So amazingly empowering for both the children and for the teaching staff. So that's why I got so excited, because I think Sarah just described it beautifully.
Absolutely, completely agree. That's and it also felt like when you were talking about the every student contributing, that it kind of lowered the stakes a little bit. So when they were starting their reasoning questions, where they all contributed to the board, it could be perhaps anonymous, so it feels like they're not as exposed at that stage.
Yeah, I think it just definitely the tools, especially with maths, just enables children to practice first and then to share when they feel comfortable to do so.
In your book, From EdTech to PedTech, Changing the Way We Think About Digital Technology, you encourage readers to explore their pedagogical beliefs and kind of emphasise the importance of that. And reading it definitely felt more like I was attending CPD than kind of reading a book in a way, because there's lots of self-reflection in the book. I found it really interesting doing some of those activities as well to explore and uncover some of my own pedagogical beliefs. Do you have any advice for schools in how they could adopt any of these considerations when thinking about PedTech, perhaps planning CPD or having those conversations about what they're doing with technology?
I love your reflection that it felt like a bit of a CPD program, because the research behind that book actually came from my doctoral research, and I wanted to convert it into that kind of it's not workbook exactly, but that very sort of interactive kind of material, because actually all of this is ultimately us all just asking ourselves one very simple question, isn't it? Is why are we doing this and where are we going? And so the design of the book was intended to make that a very kind of immersive process. And a lot of my day-to-day work at the moment is working with school leaders and teachers in schools, in classrooms, working through very similar kinds of activities. I think in terms of sort of advice, I find the word advice very uncomfortable. If someone wants to start thinking about this PedTech approach, to start adopting a PedTech mindset, I think the very beginnings of that are, what do you actually believe about the structural support for learning? What do you actually believe it means to be a learner? What do you actually think learning is? What's this thing that we call learning? What do you personally believe the role of the teacher is in a contemporary landscape? When AI can automate so much for us, like, what is the role of the human, and what's the point of going to school? What do you really believe the purpose of schooling is? What's the purpose of education? What is it? Why do we work in this space? What's the thing that we're all working on or towards? And each of us will have slightly different views on that stem back to our own childhood experiences, our lived reality of the world so far, all sorts of influences and things, and there's loads of that in the book. But the starting point needs to be, what do you personally actually believe? And it's actually quite a tricky one to surface, because often in education, particularly in the schools sector, we can talk about things with a borrowed vocabulary that we might have borrowed from policy or colleagues, or sort of popular themes and things and trends we see in other schools, etc. So what we say isn't always perfectly aligned with what we deeply believe internally, and we may or may not even realise that. I'm sure we all have that every day. So a real investment of unpicking what we actually personally believe is a massive it is critical, and it does require a good chunk of thought time, and it's not something you can do in a half an hour task. It's something to keep asking oneself, keep reflecting, keep probing, and the more we can talk about these ideas together with colleagues, and the more we can sort of challenge our own thinking and the thinking of others, the better. There's a collective gain in that, isn't it? Your talking brings clarity. So the start point, clarity on what we actually believe. Once we've got that, then, and I think it's a work in progress, I don't think we'll have ever nailed it completely, but then we're able to kind of go out with a lens that's looking for tools, whether they're digital or not digital, but we go out looking for tools that will help us to be the teacher or the leader or the learner that we really want to be. And if we do that, actually that makes everything else that follows much, much simpler, because if we have the tool that's right for us, it makes the tool more effective and it makes us more effective. So in terms of investment of our time, as well as financial investment in tools, everyone's a winner in that scenario. But the critical impact for all of this, and the thing that we all ultimately believe is most important, and so important that we often even forget to mention it, is what's the impact on the children and young people we work with? What difference will any of this make to their lives? And by that, I don't mean let's think about how we intend for it to make an impact. I mean, what are they actually experiencing? What are they actually internalising? How does this actually make them feel as a learner? And to go back to the point Sarah was making about that participation in the classroom, if our children and young people feel that they can now demonstrate their knowledge and understanding in a way that's right for them and that really shows their capabilities, or if they feel that they can now participate in an activity or contribute an answer or an idea with dignity rather than having to be brave or feeling highly anxious, if a child is able to use tools to help them record creatively their work in a way that allows them to share that with their teacher, with their family, with other people. If we're making those kinds of differences for young people, then our time is well spent, isn't it?
Absolutely. That exploration and those conversations about our own pedagogical beliefs, and I feel like that if that happened more in schools, that would benefit everyone, whether it linked to technology or not. I really found that very interesting, and that independence for learners. And you mentioned metacognition earlier, and it's beyond just adaptive teaching, but enabling the students, the pupils, to be very kind of independent. And we touched on AI, which could be a whole other conversation as well, which is again really interesting area. But again, some of those tools, AI tools that support learners to be more independent, I think again some of them very simple ones are very interesting. If I could just switch back to Sarah now, just to ask about anything that you found really useful. What would you say to a primary school that wants to go one-to-one with devices, and what advice would you give them in terms of keeping that focus on the pedagogy whilst doing that?
Yeah, I think Fiona's just wonderfully summarised it.
Absolutely.
I think having that real clarity and being really methodical in your approach. So again, in the same way that there are lots of tools out there, we've got lots of research now to show that technology can have tremendous results on learning. That's not without careful kind of thinking behind it, and always going back to that, why are we doing what we're doing, what are we trying to address, and how are we going to be helping our children to be the successful learners. So always starting with those kind of thoughts first. I think it's always good as well to think about the staff CPD. So teaching is obviously a wonderful job, but it's quite easy to feel overwhelmed with new things. But if we can show why we're using technology and how it's going to be helpful into the classroom, I think that's really helpful and supportive for teachers to see why we're using it, and easier to get teachers on board as well.
Yes.
So we've really thought about that kind of CPD package for staff about how we're using certain tools in the school. So we have like a fortnightly digital digest where we'll just talk through what's working in the classroom, how's the technology supporting the children, and that's been really helpful to kind of reflect again on, is this working, do we need to change our way of working in any way. And I guess my final piece of advice would be to reach out to other schools that are already using the Chromebook. So again, we've had such tremendous support from the teachers at the Leo Academy, especially Cheryl and Graham, who've just been so helpful and so supportive in helping us to go one-to-one. And I definitely could not come on a podcast without mentioning our lovely digital leaders. And again, this was something that we saw at the Academy, where there were some wonderful children who could talk so amazingly about how technology was supporting. So we borrowed their lovely idea of having digital leaders. And it's just had a really great impact with our rollout of the one-to-one. If any children were feeling a bit like, I'm not too sure how I do this on my Chromebook, the digital leaders off their own back, they come up with the idea of a mentoring scheme. So at lunch times and break times, they invite children to their digital leader office and they support them with using technology. So that's just been a really lovely thinking of the staff CPD, but also the children, and that's just been wonderful to see how they're really helping to upskill other children as well.
That's fantastic. It's so powerful having pupils to doing the kind of the teaching or the training on kind of that for other pupils and kind of for staff. And I've heard you say a few times now, Sarah, as well, starting with the why, and that kind of reminds me of the Simon Sinek kind of idea of starting with the why, but really important to have that vision in place. That sharing of practice, you mentioned the digital digest as well, and that reaching out to other schools and going to visit them as well. So I'm going to just come to our last kind of question. And I mentioned, Fiona, earlier, at Chiltern Learning Trust, we're really big fans of the work that you've done, and obviously a really significant book and the report as well. But we were just really interested to ask, what are you working on at the moment, and what's the best way to follow your work? And dare I say, are there any reports or any other books on the way?
There's always lots of learning going on, isn't there, across all of it? So in terms of things on the way, at the moment, I've got the great privilege of working with a number of trusts and groups of schools who are all at different stages of their PedTech journey, and in each of these scenarios there's a different kind of flavour or a different characteristic that we're exploring. And so over the course of the year there are further sort of impact studies that will be coming published that sort of bring other angles to this conversation. I think the more that we can think about what these things look like in different sizes, in different contexts, the more insights we have about what are the common themes, what are the common threads, and what things are relevant to schools who see pedagogy differently to another school. That's really, really important. There isn't one single right way to structure a school. There isn't one single right way to teach or to learn. Different people would think different things, and each of us will feel like the way we see things is the right way, but that's because it's based on deep-seated value systems. So what we need to do is make sure we've got something for everybody. And that's why when we wrote the book, we deliberately didn't say this is how we think learning should be, this is how we think teaching should be, because it is different for different people, and that's okay. What we want to do is empower everybody to think what is right for your school, your context, your role, your learners, and then meet those needs, supported with digital and other tools. And so central to all of this, I think I just want to come back to something that is I think it's in chapter 1 of the book, where we talk about the 6 things every school leader and teacher should know. And we've touched on a lot of those actually in this conversation today. But one thing that's really important is this notion of trust. And that is trusting our learners and trusting our staff and trusting ourselves. That it's important to have a go and to try things out. It's important to recognise in any learning space, whether that's a classroom or a professional learning environment, that we are all learners. We don't have all the answers, any of us. The most valuable thing we can do is ask lots of questions and listen to lots of different perspectives. And trusting in ourselves that, let's just explore, let's try, let's keep talking, let's keep thinking, as long as we are morally rooted in trying to support the learning of all those we work with, whether they're children or adults, then we're on the right track. And that's why, Sarah, it's lovely that you were referring to the support from the Leo Academy Trust earlier on. I think one thing that's in the Changing Learning, Changing Lives report that really speaks to that point is that as an organisation, they see themselves as being driven by this moral imperative to view everybody as a learner and to support the learning of each other, with each other. And I think, Sarah and Christian, you reflect that in your own work. You share that same vision. And I think that's what's behind, ultimately, making impact from a pedagogy-first perspective.
Thank you so much, Fiona. What a great way to finish with, we're all learners. And I've certainly learnt a lot from speaking to both of you and found it really inspirational. Thank you so much for your time on the podcast. And I know the listeners will find this incredibly useful as well. I hope we're going to work with you again, Fiona, and see you again hopefully soon at Chiltern Learning Trust. But thank you so much for taking the time to join us on this podcast. And Sarah, thank you so much for joining as well and giving us your insights into what you're doing at the school. And thank you both so much for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you.